Everyone, welcome to the USGS Landslide Hazard Seminar. I'm Stephen Slaughter, and this meeting is hosted by the Landslide Hazards Program. The seminar is presented as a presentation by researchers, academics, students, and professional geologists from private industry and government agencies who are working on some aspect of landslides and landslide science. The seminar is co-organized by Matt Thomas, Jamie Koselnick, and me. The presentation is about 50 minutes long, and at the end, you can submit questions via the chat window or use the raise your hand feature in combination with the microphone and video camera. We typically wait until the end of the presentation to take questions. During the presentation, please remember to keep your microphone and cameras turned off. Today's speaker is Jeff Keck from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and he is introduced by Katie Barnhart of the USGS. Katie?
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's a real distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Jeff Keck to you all. I'm really excited that we're going to get to see this work he's done, which really takes sort of a top of the watershed down into the main stem channels perspective on the impact of landslides. So Jeff comes to us jointly from the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, where he's worked for 8 years, and as a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. At the DNR, Jeff focuses some of his time on research on the impacts of forest hydrology on geomorphic processes and as an in-house consulting geologist, and has degrees in civil engineering, forest engineering, and geosciences from Oregon State, National Taiwan University, and the University of Washington. With that, I'll hand it over to Jeff, and I very much looking forward to your talk.
All right, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. I'm going to turn off my camera. All right, so the MassWastingRouter is a watershed-scale sediment production and transport model where the primary source of production is landslides. That's designed for landscapes like you see in the background here, where landslides, which are generally limited to specific topographic regions of the landscape, mobilize sediment from the hill slope, transport it down into the channel network. Those deposits of sediment are remobilized in the fluvial part of the channel network as bedload, and they eventually make their way to the basin outlet. This work is part of NSF project that I'm doing with Erkan Istanbulu. He's my PhD advisor, and also part of the research that I'm doing at the Olympic Experimental State Forest as the hydrologist in this hydrology role at Washington for the state of Washington. So the objective of this coupled model is prediction. We're hoping to be able to predict how climate change, which might affect landslides, or land use, which might affect landslides, ultimately end up in the bedload transport time series at the basin outlet. The purpose of trying to understand how bedload will respond to landslides is, one, for flood hazard modeling studies down in the lowlands. If you fill a channel with sediment, the same flow that might have gone through it no problem before now becomes a flood. The other objective is for aquatic habitat studies in Washington and the Pacific Northwest in general. There's salmon. The salmon, they depend on a specific range of gravel sizes. If you change the gravel size or scour away all the gravels, you impact the salmon habitat. So for both of these purposes, our objective is to predict how landslides end up affecting bedload at the basin outlet. We're not the first to try and couple climate with landslides and debris flows and then model bedload transport. Other authors before us have done this, probably many. I have two here in addition to the one that I'll be presenting. that use contrasting approaches. The Benda and Dunn 1997 model, they conceptualized the channel network as a network of links, and at the heads of the links, sediment was produced by these zero-order basins or hollows. These stochastic pulses of sediment end up affecting bedload in the main stem channel. Bennett, 2014, they created the Cascade model, which envisions the basin as a series of reservoirs. There's a hill slope reservoir, a water storage reservoir, and both of these, the water storage reservoir sends a time series of flow to the channel storage reservoir. The hill slope storage reservoir sends off a number of stochastic hill slope signals, and sort of the balance of flow rates versus sediment inputs end up determining how much sediment is transported through the channel. The MassWastingRouter, okay, we're going for a detailed topographic representation of the basin, and we're including models for individual processes. So different approaches. Bennett et al., she talks about some of the advantage of using sort of this basin average approach. It requires fewer parameters, but as I'll show later on, most of the submodels are designed in a way so that they have as few parameters as possible. Everything I show today is coded in Landlab, or it's coded in Python, I should say, for the package Landlab. And Landlab has a number of existing geomorphic models, including Flow Director, which Katie wrote. And this just determines like the D8 flow direction or the multi-flow direction of a DEM. There's LandslideProbability by Rhonda Strach and Erkin Istanbulu. And there's the NetworkSedimentTransporter by Allison Pfeiffer, Katie, and John Chuba. There's also a couple of different model grids in Landlab that are very user-friendly. I end up using the raster model grid and the network model grid in the work I'll show you here. Landlab also has tools for easily converting output from Landlab or importing output from ArcGIS or going back and forth. So this makes for an easy workflow of preparing your model inputs in ArcGIS, bringing them into Landlab, writing your model or using an existing component, running the model, and then taking your output and looking at it in ArcGIS. So taking a step back now, everything I present today is going to be in context of forest management here in Washington. I'll be bouncing around from sites west of the Cascades. In the role of the geologist consultant, I'm usually looking at how a harvest on a hill slope might affect peak flows and the channel stability, or how a harvest near a deep-seated landslide might affect the stability of that existing landslide. On the Olympic Peninsula, I have about 10 flow gauges, and this flow data will be used as part of the calibration process for the model. Okay, so to begin with, we go to the Olympic Peninsula. We're on the west side of the Olympics. We're going to look at this basin. It's just west of Mount Olympus. You've got the foothills of Olympus here, Queets River to the south, Hoh River to the north, Forks and Vampires for the Twilight fans up here. This is what it looks like about now, currently. If we go back about 30 years ago, it looked like this. And this is forest management standards 30 years ago. This scale of vegetation disturbance, when you see that today, or at least during the last 5 to 10 years, people are now thinking fire. But just a couple of decades ago, the typical cause of such wide-scale disturbance was, I guess, the management that we decided to apply to our public and private lands. Let's zoom in. We're taking a look at this. You can see how they built roads, going through all sorts of channels. They harvested down to the steepest part of the watershed. Here's intact chunks of forest that they never harvested. You can see they triggered some landslides. These landslides aren't on the scale that we saw at that first image I had from Taiwan, but they are triggering landslides. that deposited down in the valley of the basin. So how do you take a complex system of both vegetation, land use, time series of climate, hill slope processes, depositional processes, and then eventual transport as bedload? How do you take that and turn it into a numerical model? And our approach is as follows. We have a number of submodels. First is the distributed hydrology generator. This is the engine of the entire MassWastingRouter system. It generates soil water conditions in the hill slopes and flow in the network, channel network. We use landslide probability, an existing component, to get the probability of failure within the basin. We, because we're not interested in hazard zones, we want zones that are going to produce sediment. We convert those probability maps into maps of landslides, so we get landslide polygons. These landslide polygons become input for a debris flow program called MassWastingRunout. The deposits from MassWastingRunout, then now they're in the channel network, they are eroded and inserted into the network model grid by MassWastingRouter. And finally, we use the existing NetworkSedimentTransporter to transport that sediment that's in the channel network towards the basin outlet. Okay, so the format of this presentation, I'm just going to go over each one of these model steps. And then at the end, we're going to put them all together and run it. So first, the distributed hydrology generator. The distributed hydrology generator is a stochastic storm generator that is designed to be parameterized from the output of an externally run distributed hydrology model. So by distributed, I mean that hydrology isn't just modeling flow at the basin outlet. It's modeling flow in each reach of the watershed and each location in the hill slopes. And so by each location in the hill slope, it would be each cell. So we use DHSVM as our distributed hydrology model. DHSVM is modeling evapotranspiration processes, surface runoff, subsurface flow, base flow. It routes all of that water at the grid scale downslope based on the slope. When that hill slope water intersects a link, it exfiltrates and then flows this open channel flow in the link. If you run a model like DHSVM for, say, 30 years, that gives you a time series of soil water conditions at each grid cell and flow at each link for 30 years. From that, just typical hydrologic analysis, you extract an annual maximum series and use that to then parameterize a probability density function for annual maximum flow events at your links and annual maximum soil water conditions in each grid. So for example, in this model, I think there's about 30 to 40,000 grid cells and maybe about 30 links. So we end up with about 30 to 40,000 parameterized probability density functions of depth of soil water and flow. From that, we can generate an infinitely long time series of soil water conditions and flow in the reaches by sampling those PDFs using a consistent quantile. And that's an example of that is shown here. Okay, so that's distributed hydrology generator. It's the engine for the whole process. Now we're going to go to landslide probability. Landslide probability, written by Rhonda Strach and Erkan Istanbulu. It solves for, or the infinite slope formula at each grid cell. It includes cohesion. Cohesion is probably the biggest factor in here. There's a relative wetness term here, and typically relative wetness, if you use sort of the shell stab approach, you're determining that based on your contributing area and precipitation amount. Here, our relative wetness is determined from the soil thickness minus the depth to water table. The depth to water table is coming from distributed hydrology generator. To determine the probability at each cell, so the user to run this, they have to give at each grid cell location the minimum, mode, and max values of total cohesion. So that includes soil and vegetation, the mode values of the friction angle, and the mode of the soil thickness. What landslide probability does, it then runs a user-defined number of iterations. I think the default's 250, and the number of iterations that have a factor of safety less than 1 over the total number of iterations is your probability of landsliding. That's landslide probability. Okay, but that just gives us a hazard map. And I guess that's what I was saying before, that's not useful for determining what parts of the hill slopes are going to generate sediment. Landslides don't look like a hazard map. They're isolated. So then we turn to the LandslideMapper. Okay, and so this is a new tool. It's a simple tool that uses a couple of rules to interpret that hazard map into landslide polygons. The first is a simple threshold. The probability of failure has to be greater than a threshold amount. That filters out to just a certain number of squares. Then those remaining squares, if they're going to become a landslide polygon, need to be adjacent and on a non-divergent slope. So on the right, here's an example output from landslide probability. Now we run it through LandslideMapper. You can see these are all adjacent. This one is not, so that's not going to get canceled. And this one here, the slope is planar to a little bit convergent. This one, though, is on a divergent slope. So LandslideMapper would automatically interpret these cells into a landslide polygon like that. Okay, and here's example output of Mapper taking the actual landslide probability output and interpreting, looks like about 4 polygons. Those met the criteria. Now we go to MassWastingRunout. So those polygons become the input for the debris flow program. MassWastingRunout is a debris flow program, and in my review of the literature, debris flow models can broadly be divided into 3 categories. You have empirical, like Benda and Kunde's 1990 model. There's mechanistic models, like the Iverson et al. 2011 model. And then there's large scale in the sense of Brad Murray's 2007 paper. And there's a Lancaster et al. 2003 model that's sort of large scale. They incorporate some of the detailed mechanistic physics from the Iverson et model into their model, but they ultimately rely on a lot of relatively simple rules and equations that require fewer parameters to control the large-scale behavior of the debris flow. So MassWastingRunout also falls into this latter category. It uses a large-scale model design that relies on simple equations to determine the flow into erosion, entrainment, deposition, and flow out of each cell. It's calibrated with just 2 parameters, and there's 1 additional parameter that's determined from the field. So first, flow, shallow water flow is approximated using the multi-flow direction. So Katie's component that she put into Landlab, I just use that directly. And the way that works is flow from any individual cell is directed to all its downslope cells based on the weighted average slope. So for example, here, the largest slope is down, so most of this material would go down. The smallest proportion of this material would go to this cell. At each cell, as a volume of material divides into smaller pieces or combines with other pieces, at each cell, we're solving the mass balance, where the material exiting the cell is simply equal to the material that enters it minus the deposition amount plus the entrainment amount. And here's where one of the parameters comes in. In order to avoid unrealistically thin flows, we say that if this incoming flow is less than some threshold amount, it stops. So that's a parameter. Also, at each cell, we're evolving the terrain. I think this is sort of in the spirit of Landlab. It's a landscape evolution toolbox. So this debris flow also evolves the terrain, and that the change in the elevation of each cell is simply the deposition minus the erosion amount. Erosion is simply the minimum of either the soil depth, it can't exceed the soil depth, or a coefficient, this is another parameter, times the basal shear stress of the flow. And deposition, right now I'm using this rule, which comes from the literature, but also experimenting with others. But in all cases, deposition is simply a function of a critical deposition slope, or a friction angle of the material. So in total, there's 3 parameters. You've got that mass waste to material friction angle, which is approximated from the field. And by the field, I mean you walk out to an existing deposit with a clinometer, put your eye in line with the deposit and get the slope of the deposit. That's how I have used this so far, and it works well. The other 2, presently, you've got that threshold flow depth below which you force things to stop, and the erosion coefficient. So far, I'm just using these as calibration parameters. You just iteratively run the model, adjusting these 2 until you get modeled results to match observations. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate application of this runout model. We're going to go down to the south part of Washington by Mount St. Helens, and this is a landslide that occurred this winter. It reactivated an existing landslide, flowed down the scar of the existing landslide, or the runout from the past landslide, went past a road up here, and then intersected another road down here. So this is the landslide in 2009 when it first failed. It was catastrophic. It was huge. And in that case, it also covered both roads, the upper road up here, the lower road down here. It had enough momentum that it completely crossed the river and also took out the forest on the opposite side of the river. This year, much smaller, just this small chunk really failed. And you can see the scar from the runout is just, it's a fraction of the width that it was before. It made it to the river, but it didn't cause damage on the opposite side of the river. We have a 2019 LiDAR scan of this scar. And then we also, shortly after this occurred, some people in the DNR went out, flew a drone, and created an image-based DEM. The image-based DEM, it's accurate in the scar of the debris flow. So we can do DEM differencing to get the pattern of where areas were scoured or deposited, and that's on the right. You can see the landslide body was here, deposited initially at the top, scour here, deposited upslope of the road, continue down here, bigger deposition, and then scour in this steep, narrow part, and then more deposition at the lower road. Okay, I'm going to walk you through the debris flow runout paths just so you get a feel for the material. And this is these photos are from John Jenkins. We're up at the top, and the material here is weathered basaltic andesite and epiclastic sandstone with gravel to cobble intrusions. The epiclastic sandstone is deeply weathered, hand rippable, and contains a high Clayton silt fraction. And if you look at it, so this is where it failed. It's the depth of the landslide is deep. It's like, I don't know, at least 10 to 15 meters, and you don't see a lot of intact in place bedrock. This is rotten rock. You can pick up some of it and just shape it with your hand, even in some cases. Moving down, you can see along the edges the fines to class fraction. This is, when I was looking at it, I was estimating like 75-85% sand and finer, only 15 to 25% gravels. So this is mostly this gooey, fine stuff that flowed over the road here, continued down here. But even though it lacks a lot of large clasts that might lock against each other, it's depositing at a slope of about 12%. Moving down, this is what it looks like where it crossed the road. Okay, so I'm going to set up MassWastingRunout to run this, and I set that friction angle at 12%. I measured that in the field. These other 2 through trial and error about 10 times came up with these 2 parameters. I'm using a 5-meter grid in ArcGIS. I went and mapped the area where the new landslide occurred. So I've got my model set up. So here's what it looked, the aerial view of the landslide. This is the differencing, and now I'm going to release the landslide using MassWastingRunout. So there it is interacting with the first road, sort of goes down the ditch a bit and then pours over. Big area of deposition here. You see how the debris flow, that initial mass, it's bulking up as it deposits. It's also entraining. It hit the second road and now it flows down into the river. This amount in the field was washed away by the river. Okay, so comparing the observed with modeled, in plan view, it appears we got the general pattern of deposition and scour. Not perfect, like for some reason I've got an area of deposition here that was not observed. In a two-dimensional representation of that pattern of deposition, if we just look at the cumulative volumetric deposition amount moving upstream from the base, there's also a similar spatial pattern in deposition, though that magnitude isn't perfect. Like maybe my initial landslide was too small, it looks like. So something I still need to refine with this model. Now we'll move to Potosi Creek. We're coming up by Olympia in Capitol Forest. And we're in weathered basalt now, thick weathered basalt. Some of the regolith measurements here are around 30 feet thick. But the landslide itself actually occurred in this road fill. And this road fill was probably a bunch of regolith pushed into place by a bunch of bulldozers, maybe mixed with organics. So it's a mix of junk regolith with some organics. This is what failed. We'll walk down this again, just like we did the last one. We're starting at the landslide here. This one, like that 2009 failure, was catastrophic. It just wiped out a swath of these really pretty large Douglas fir trees. But the deposit is different. There's the grain to fine ratios much different. There's way more clasts and a lot more wood. Wood appears to have affected how this moved through the basin. It left these big, wide, clean areas where it seemed to just scour everything. And then it deposited on really low slopes. The other one was depositing on a slope of about 12%. This one's at a slope of 1%. Okay, so the same thing as the last one. I map the initial landslide polygon. This is what's going to be released. From the field, I got a slope of 1%. These other two parameters are through trial and error to parameterize it to match. I'm using a 10-meter grid. So up here is the observed. Oh, for here we have two LiDAR data sets. So observed deposition and scour patterns are from subtraction of the two LiDAR before and after data sets. I release my road fill. Goes rushing down the valley, taking out the Douglas fir. And here it's mostly scouring, so it's bulking up. It's lengthening. There are some areas of deposition that don't match exactly the observed deposition location. Gets down to the wider part of the valley, it starts to spread. To the right again is that 2D version that compares the spatial distribution of deposition. And about 2,000 meters up here, I'm depositing more than I should be. So I need to look into that. It could be a problem with my DM. But again, general patterns match, and plan view, it looks pretty good too. And that's relying on one of those parameters being that field determined friction angle. Okay, so for in the last, we come back up to the Olympic Peninsula. We're back in the Clearwater. We're looking at Kunamas Creek, East Fork Kunamas Creek. And here, this one's a little different because there were many landslides that occurred between 1980 and 2007 after they started harvesting. So in my air photo review of this basin, looking at about, maybe 15 different sets of air photos, I've mapped these landslide scars. So again, I'll walk you through this basin. We're in different geology again. We're in steeply dipping to vertical massive beds of siltstone and sandstone. And when this stuff fails, the siltstone ends up breaking down pretty quickly, and you end up with a lot of sandstone clasts in the channel. So moving down slope from the top here, scour depths are about 3/4 of a meter. You get down into this junction, and it looks like deposits were about 2 meters thick. You've got big sandstone clasts. The clasts are definitely contacting each other. You'll also notice the alder that's reclaimed the deposits. Further down, there's huge log jams, 3 to 4 meter thick log jams that cause these valley filling deposits. So the channel, the actual topography of the channel is completely buried by these deposits. Moving further down, once we get past sort of this big log jam area, there's thinner deposits that are maybe 1 meter thick with lobes along the edges. There's steep ridges where there's no deposits at all. It seems to have just blown past these areas. And then down at the bottom, there's not real strong evidence for deposition. You see occasional remnants of a terrace if you look hard enough in the brush. Okay, so we're going to set up the model. That friction angle parameter, it varied here from like 6% to as high as 15% at the top. So I used something roughly in the middle, 10%, and then these other two again through trial and error to get a pattern that matches what I observed in the field. So here, so I'm releasing the landslides now on the right. And in this case, I'm releasing them in sequence because I know the year that those, or the range of years that those landslides occurred. (1997) was a big year. I don't know if they all simultaneously released like that. That's how I release them. They end up interacting together. They combine, and they're in training again. The whole debris flow is bulking. And then it stops there, mostly. Small road failure up there. The patterns here on the left, red is deposition, scour is blue, and those are field mapped. I don't have LiDAR differencing to evaluate this with here. So we're almost to the end. I think 2007 or 2009 is last year. But you can see how previous debris flows, they filled the valley, and they're now impacting the depositional behavior of subsequent deep debris flows. There's also not material to bulk up with because it's been scoured by the previous debris flows. Okay, so that's an example of how MassWastingRunout works. Now we're going to go to MassWastingRouter. We've got the material in the channels, but the next step is to, we need to take that and put it into the channel network. So with this, this is conceptualized as follows. The channel network is defined as all nodes below some contributing area. I think here I used a contributing area about 5,000 square meters. Red nodes are the fluvial channel network, so that includes all, in terms of like the Montgomery and Buffington channel types, all the way up to the Cascade channel types, goes up to these red. And then green are terrace cells. So these are areas along the channel where sediment can be deposited and the channel can interact with it. And any of these cells that have debris flow material on them inject that material into the network model at a rate like this. So on the x-axis here is years since disturbance, and on the left here is average erosion per storm. And this pattern of erosion is based on a review of the literature for people who reported sediment transport following large storm events or debris flows. And then I scaled it to a magnitude that matches the amount of volume that's been removed from the channel in this basin relative to what's left. So this is, the pattern is based on the literature, and then it's scaled to match what I see in the field. So that's eroder. It's a simple function of time since disturbance that sends sediment into the network. One other thing, when it sends it into the network, it sends it as a parcel. And parcels are how the network sediment transporter is conceptualized. So this is that existing component by Allison Pfeiffer, Katie Barnhart, John Chuba, that transports sediment using the Wilcock and Crow 2003 equations. With those equations, each parcel has a grain size and a volume. It can determine the transport time and the transport rate of each parcel through the network. In this example network, when I've run it in the past, I may have 10 to 20,000 parcels, and the combined movement of those parcels gives you bedload transport at the basin outlet. Okay, so we went through all parts of the model. Now we're going to put it all together. So we begin with an externally run hydrology model that we force with either historic or forecasted or predicted climate data. We have to calibrate it. We can do that with the OSF hydrographs. From that, then we can parameterize the PDFs of soil, water, and flow at all locations in the basin. With our parameterized distributed hydrology generator, then we have our motor now to run the rest of the process. LandslideProbability, LandslideMapper, MassWastingRunout, MassWastingRouter, and eventually the NetworkSedimentTransporter. So how do you implement that though in the code? And I have it structured right now as sort of a 3-loop process. With the parameterized distributed hydrology generator, it's running every iteration. It's picking a storm magnitude. If there's hill slopes, or if the hill slopes are activated, it'll run loop 3. If the hill slopes are not activated, but there's terraces, there's a deposit next to the channel, it'll run loop 2. And if there's no terraces and the hill slopes are not active, it runs loop 1. In loop 1, it's just transporting whatever sediment, whatever parcels are in that network sediment model. In loop 2, it runs MassWastingRouter and takes a little bit of that terrace material and injects new parcels into the network model. And in loop 3, when those hill slopes are active, then you end up running all of the components, probability, mapper, runout. Right now, I have this structured because landslide probability, you don't get landslides for most of the storms the way I have it parameterized right now. So I only have this triggered if a storm event is larger than a 2.5-year event. Okay, so that's how it's run in the code. All those are coupled together. Now we're back at East Fork, Kunamas Creek. It's green. It's been 40 years. It's covered by uniform tree farms where it was harvested before. You still have the clumps of the original forest here. I want to predict how bedload transport is going to change in the future. So I do that by getting gridded meteorology data. I set up DHSVM. So I take a DM. DHSVM requires other like soil depth and hydraulic conductivity type inputs. I calibrate DHSVM because we have flow observations in this basin. From the calibrated DHSVM model, I run it for 30 years. I get a time series of precipitation and depth of soil water in the basin. I use that to parameterize the distributed hydrology generator. MassWastingRouter, there's 3 other components that then need to be parameterized. Landslide probability needs maps of cohesion, friction angle, soil depth. MassWastingRunout, you have to pick these 3 parameters. That friction angle one you can get from the field. The other 2 you would probably want to first do independently, looking for some sort of observational type debris flow record to compare with. LiDAR perhaps would, combined with a field review, might be enough to do that. And then the MassWastingRouter, you need to pick your coefficient and exponent for how quickly you're going to erode that terrace material with time. So there's, this is to me, this doesn't seem like too many parameters, but at the beginning, I talked about the different approaches for combining climate with landslides to bedload transport models, these coupled modeling systems. The Bennett et al. Paper, one of their points at the beginning of their paper is that if you use a simple basin average, maybe you can avoid some of these parameters. But the way we've coded this, no, maybe these aren't too hard to get at. Okay, so now we're going to run the whole thing. And there's a lot going on in these two figures. They're running simultaneously at the same time step. So first I'll start on the left and then go to the right. The left side is showing the channel nodes in the raster model grid representation of the basin. Black ones are any cell in the channel network. Red ones are fluvial channel cells, so they're cascade channel types and lower. The green ones are terrace cells. So the channel, terrace cells, and channel network cells are all sending material into the network model grid if they have any on them. But turned off. Okay, I restarted. The blue grid cells are grid cells that have material on them. So you can see how they initially, right after you get a landslide, they're all blue. But quickly, because of that function I use as a function of time since disturbance, they become inactive because presumably they stabilize. Maybe the alders set in, the roots stabilize the material. Okay, so that's what's going on the left. Blue nodes represent active nodes that are sending material into the basin. On the right, at the top, in the top figure, you have flow at the outlet, the return interval of the flow. And the axis is return interval. The red line is the 2.5 year event. So that's what I have manually set for this basin. That's the point at which I'm going to trigger the hill slope, that loop 3 in the code. So the saturated thickness in this one, basin average saturated thickness is only computed when the return interval of the flow exceeds that 2.5 year event. In the next plot, you have sediment transport at the basin outlet. This is the goal. This is what I'm trying to get for those habitat and flood hazard applications. And you can see that first basin average, that first hill slope of it didn't, or the second one actually, didn't actually generate any sediment. It wasn't large enough to trigger landslides. The next one, though, does. So you have a pulse of sediment that goes to the outlet. And then as a function of time, you can see how the amount of sediment it's making to the outlet really follows that function of terrace erosion that I set. The bottom plot you can think of as sort of a sediment budget plot where it's showing both the cumulative sediment in the watershed and the cumulative sediment that's in the outlet. And then I also have the cumulative sediment that's in the black cells, the channel network cells. But you can see how initially, after that first pulse of material around 2028, there's about 20 to 30,000 cubic meters of sediment in the basin. It gradually drops, and that sediment makes it to the basin outlet. And as new pulses come in, the cumulative total sediment that goes out of the outlet exceeds what's left within the basin. So one of the interesting things about the way this is working is that in the end, you still have about 5 to 10% of the total amount of sediment produced remains stuck in the watershed. And that's because of how I parameterized that terrace eroding function. But I parameterized it that way based on field evidence for erosion rates and reported erosion rates following time since disturbance. And in the field, there's additional evidence that terraces may continue to store sediment over geologic timescales. This is a map of the basin to the left. Dark blue are the landslides, light blue is scour, red is deposition. This green area, though, these are strath terraces. They're bedrock terraces, and on top of them, there's thick, maybe 5 to 10 meter thick colluvial to alluvial depositions, of material that has the channel has since abandoned. It's now well below ever being able to access these deposits. So there's evidence in this basin for this sort of dynamic, where some percentage, I don't know what percentage of the sediment that's produced by the hill slopes is locked into the basin. So that was an example application of using the full MassWastingRouter. The next step for all of this will be upscaling the MassWastingRouter to predict sediment transport rates at the upstream boundary to lowland flow models. And that's really the objective of the NSF project. So the work I showed here is part of this coupling of Landlab to DHS-VM in the uplands. Now we are close to having sediment, a time series of bedload transport that we can then hand off to the lowland flood modelers who might be using Delft 3D. In conclusion, the MassWastingRouter is a simple, large-scale, yet detailed model for predicting sediment transport at the basin outlet in response to landslides. And our goal here, the intended use, is prediction, but it's still, MassWastingRouter is still in development, and the ultimate goal will be to upscale it to larger basins. So, thanks for listening. I can take questions.